Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Michael Camilleri. I direct the Dialogue's Peter D. Bell Rule of Law program. It's really my pleasure to have you all here for today's event, Latin America's Autumn of Discontent. Now, while the leaves outside in Washington are changing, some of you have helpfully pointed out that in parts of Latin America is not actually autumn. So we want to thank you for registering your objections, and thank you even more for looking past that detail and joining us this afternoon for what I'm sure will be a really fascinating discussion. So needless to say, these are turbulent times in Latin America. A seemingly innocuous metro fare hike in Chile provoked perhaps the largest demonstrations in the country's history, along with outbreaks of violence. Just weeks after austerity measures in Ecuador led to similar protests that forced the government to relocate temporarily from Quito to Guayaquil. Peru is operating without a legislature after the president dismissed Congress and briefly provoked a constitutional crisis. The presidential election in Bolivia is currently under OAS audit amidst daily protests and allegations of fraud, while elections in Argentina and possibly Uruguay promise to reshape the region's political map. That's without mentioning the ongoing anti-corruption protests and political crisis in Haiti, the New York trial that implicated the president of Honduras in his brother's drug trafficking ring, or the horrific news from Mexico this week that highlighted the country's losing battle with organized crime. So clearly a lot to sift through and try to make sense of. And fortunately, we're joined by three really fabulous panelists today. To my immediate left, Monica de Boye is director of the Latin American Studies program at Johns Hopkins SAIS. She also has the distinction of not being named Michael, so thank you, Monica, for mixing it up here for us. Michael Penfold, on the opposite end, is a professor at the Instituto de Estudios Superiores de Administración in Venezuela. He's also currently a global fellow in the Latin America program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And last but not least, Michael Shifter, president here at the American Dialogue, also known as my boss, so he'll be getting the easy questions. All right, so I'm gonna moderate a conversation here for about an hour, and we'll leave some time at the end for your questions and comments. I'm gonna start by just posing a really kind of open question to the three of you, and I think it's the question that we're all asking, which is, what the heck is happening in Latin America? Or maybe putting it a little more elegantly, what is happening in the region? Why is it happening? And Monica, starting with you, why is it happening now?
So the now part, is this on? Okay. Thank you, everybody, and thank you to the Dialogue for having me here once again. Thank you for that very kind introduction. Thank you for starting with the now question, because the now is actually easier than the why. The why, I think, has a lot of angles, and we'll be discussing a lot of them here. But the now, I think, has at least two components. The first is, it coincides obviously with this 3-year cycle of elections that we've had in the region starting in 2017. So 2017, 2018, and 2019 have been very busy years when it comes to elections in the region, as we have every so often, this coincidence of super election cycle. So the why has a lot to do with, people realizing that many things, that many frustrations, that they've been having a lot of frustrations. In some cases, that has resulted in changes in government, not so much because they were voting in people or new governments that they actually liked, but rather they were voting out governments that they disliked. And that plays, I think, a huge or a very important role in sort of trying to understand the dynamics and the social dynamics in the region at the moment. Because, of course, if a lot of these votes are actually votes of repudiation, like we saw in Mexico, like we saw in Brazil, like we saw in Argentina, to some extent, like we saw in Chile back in 2017, the elected leaders actually have limited political capital, and also, importantly, very little patience from the population at large. So they don't get a lot of time to actually do the things that they promise to do, the improvement in people's lives and so on. So I think part of the why runs through that issue of the super electoral cycle. The other part of the why, which is more economic in nature, I think has to do with something that I've been calling the sort of post-commodity boom syndrome, which is, Latin America went through these 10 years at least, or maybe a little more, of a very significant, very long, very prolonged commodity boom. We can date it more or less starting in 2004. The end date is a little bit harder because it depends on which country you are and what's the commodity that you export. But let's say it happened somewhere between 2014 and 2015. And then soon after that, you get the super electoral cycle. Now, the important thing about the commodity boom, of course, is that during those 10 years, you saw across the region this major social transformation happening in different parts of it. So we saw a lot of poverty alleviation. We saw, people coming into the middle classes from below, so from the lower ranks of the income distribution. We saw labor market formalization in parts of the region, notably in Brazil, which, by the way, you didn't mention in your opening remarks, but we'll get to it. Brazil, where you had, this very sharp drop in labor market informality, which was really important. Across the region, the drop in poverty was significant. So if you look at those 10 years, on average across the region, there was a drop in poverty rates of about 60 something percent, which is huge. And then in the last 4 years, so when you start off, looking back at 2014 or 2015, all of these social gains have either stagnated or they have reversed. In most cases, they have stagnated. The one place where they have reversed is Brazil, which we'll talk about in a little while. I won't talk much about it now. But that's where poverty rates have been on the rise. In fact, they've risen 50% in the past 4 years alone. And where you see a lot of the social, these social gains having really been reversed, as opposed to other places where they have by and large stagnated. But that stagnation or reversion, it doesn't matter. It sort of hits people at a time when, coming off of these 10 years when the region had seen such social transformation and where people were pretty much taking for granted the fact that this social transformation was going to continue going forward, suddenly seeing that stop or seeing that stagnate adds to the overall sense of frustration that was already building, because remember, this is a region that integrated over the last few years via something very bad, via corruption. So we saw corruption scandals break out throughout the region. This, of course, is a very important element when we think about how the population is reacting when they see politicians being involved in these scandals, when they see, their livelihoods not improving anymore. All of that becomes very combustible. It's a combustible combination of factors. So I think the now is because we're seeing all of these things come together in a sort of perfect storm. That's how I'd put it.
Michael Shifter. Caught you by surprise there, didn't I?
Yeah, no, I thought you were going to start. Well, thank you, Michael, for organizing this, and thanks everybody for coming. I agree with what Monica just said. But, I think we should first say at the outset that really all of these situations are so particular and so unique. So why now? A plausible answer could be coincidence. I mean, that doesn't mean that all of these things that Monica just alluded to aren't happening. If they are happening, the frustration of the people who entered the middle class in Brazil and other countries in Chile and the blocks of social mobility and all of that, which is true. But I think really, each situation is very, very different. And there could just be a coincidence. I mean, we had an election in Bolivia, and the people are on the streets because it's had been perceived to be a fraudulent election, that Evo Morales stole the election. That is a reaction to that issue. Chile, I happen to think we could talk about this some more, but the more I think about it, Vargas Llosa just had a column which I found persuasive in La Tercera like 2 days ago, where he said, that Chile really, this is kind of Chile's unofficial welcome to the OECD. That this has more in common perhaps with France, and the Yellow Jackets than it does with other places in Latin America. And that it's undeniable, despite the fact that two things we always knew about Chile: there was tremendous inequality, and it had a political class of both right and left that was very disconnected to citizens. I mean, we've been saying that for a long time. At the same time, the performance of Chile's economy and the reduction of poverty, as you say, has been undeniable. And so I think what's going on is a little bit of that it worked, but now it's at a point where it hasn't worked and it has to be completely changed. And I think that's the message that was sent not only to Piñera, but also to the opposition parties as well. Whether they'll heed the message and respond effectively is another question. And I think that was similar to what we saw in France. I'm not a specialist on France, but it just seems to me much more in line. So I think that's the why in Chile. And, Ecuador is a fiscal, Chile has money. Ecuador is in a tremendous fiscal crisis, social crisis, and very weak political institutions. And the indigenous movement there, CONAI, has been very, very active for many, many years. It's probably the most coherent and powerful indigenous organization in Latin America, as far as I know. And so, this lifting the subsidies, it was not surprising that lifting the fuel subsidies, not surprising this would trigger a massive reaction. So, the Nación of Argentina on October 25th had a map of Latin America, and it went through all the crises, all the countries, and they all, and I think they were right. They all had different crises. Some have political crises, institutional crises, economic crisis, social crisis. And I think those distinctions are important, not only to understanding what's going on, but also to coming up with adequate responses to address them. So that's a little bit, I am not sure there is a moment now, although everything that Monica said is completely true. But it still begs the question, sort of, why now? We've had this, why this moment? But those are clear developments that are certainly part of the environments for the context and within which these kind of crises tend to take place.
Great, thank you, Michael. Michael Penfold.
Well, first of all, thank you, Michael, for the introduction, and it's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to share my thoughts on the most recent waves of protests in Latin America. I would start saying it's not the first wave. This is another wave, right? 2 or 3 years ago, we had a wave of street protests in Nicaragua, which were really based on fiscal authority measures, which ended up being a political crisis. We had protests in Venezuela too, and we had protests in Brazil and in Chile too. So it's not the first wave. This is more of another round of street protests in the region. Perhaps what's striking about it is the size. It's the momentum. It's the dimension, the scale of these protests. And also it's striking the differences, not only the similarities, but the differences. Look at, street protests in Ecuador compared to Chile, for example. Yes, they're different in terms of, in Ecuador, it's coming more from the fiscal side than in Chile, but they're related to subsidies basically, and transportation subsidies, and And one of them, both have street protests. One of them is more violent than the other. But at the end, there is a process in Ecuador that ends with a negotiation of some sort, and in Chile is more contentious, I think. And that's a big difference, and I think it's something that is worthwhile sort of highlighting. What I think, why now? When you look at the polls, Latino Barometro polls or LAPO polls, there's one striking commonality across most of the countries in Latin America. And there is this very strong perception on behalf of the population, particularly low-income sectors, that there is some state capture going on, that the elites have captured the policy-making process. Support for democracy in the region remains high, by the way. So the real sort of perception is that the policy-making process and the policy outcomes are not working, at least in favor of certain sectors within society, or that they're skewed, that they're not. There's a fairness issue behind them. There's a transparency issue behind them. And therefore, there's, I think, a very strong questioning of how this a policy-making process by which major decisions regarding changes in prices, for example, for public transportation is taking place. And I think it's a key aspect. And that's happening. Like for example, in Chile, 74% of the population perceives that the policy-making process is captured in some way. Whether that's true or not, we can debate about it. But there is this very strong perception that that's happening. In Ecuador, it's 81%. In Peru, it's 84%. In Bolivia, it's 60%. And in Colombia, for example, it's 80%, 81%. So it's very high. So I think that's one element. The second element that I would like to highlight, which Monica was mentioning, has to do with the emergence, during the super commodity cycle of this sort of Latin American middle class, right? But there's a particular distinction about the Latin American middle class, which is very distinctive from other middle classes when you compare it across the developing world. And it has to do with expectations. There's a very large percentage of individuals in Latin America that, not being middle class in terms of income, perceive themselves as part of that middle class. And of course, once commodity prices go down, that vulnerable sector that we've called, people earning between $10 to $20 per day, are reversing to poverty. And they are not only coping with fear, they're coping with also frustration. And that's, I think it's a very important element. In fact, when you look at the reversal of this vulnerable sector, as Monica was mentioning, it's been very large in many different countries. But what is even more striking is the percentage of people that, after the correction in commodity prices in most of the region, and the deceleration of economic growth, there's almost 30% of the population that, being poor, still perceive themselves as part of that middle class. So there is that expectation. I would like also to mention another element, which goes back to a key question, which is this sort of mass? I mean, I think the other commonality here is it's mass mobilization. This is a time where mass mobilization in Latin America matters, indistinctly of countries. And I think that is very interesting, because what you're seeing is that in some countries, people are preferring to use that kind of protest rather than more formal channels of participation. And the big question there is, why is that happening? Does that mean that people are less, that trust less formal institutions? Is this a crisis about representative democracy, or is this a crisis about the policy-making process itself? I mean, what's going on? And my feeling, and I'll conclude here, is that it is very tempting, as Vargas Llosa was saying, you know, to compare Chile to France, but I would be more careful. You know, there was a time, I'm Venezuelan. There was a time, right, where Venezuela was the poster child in the region, right? I mean, this was the most stable democracy in the region. You know, we were among the, you know, high middle income countries in the world, global energy player. Now we produce less oil than Colombia. Imagine, you know, what a backslide that is. But in 1989, we had huge riots, huge social riots, were very violent. And there was this sort of, you know, the whole debate was really, what was this? Why did this happen? Was it because of the fiscal austerity measures and raising up the gasoline prices as they were raised and triggered the riots? Was it because democracy was under a stress and representative democracy was in a big crisis? Or was it because simply the people felt that the policy-making process did not work? And, you know, Venezuela went through massive reforms, political reforms, even economic reforms. But the policy-making process was not changed. And I think at the end we have to be very careful in how we make these readings in these different countries in terms of what is really that the people are perceiving that is driving their protest.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michael. It's a really rich, I think, initial set of comments, and all of you I think point to a particular kind of confluence of both political and economic factors. And before we jump into some of the specific cases, maybe just to take some more general questions, Monica's the economist on the panel. I'll turn to you for maybe just to drill down on the economic piece a little bit more. The word inequality comes up a lot in kind of the coverage of what's happening, especially in Chile, which may be an interesting prism through which to view this question, because if there's a country that seemingly had kind of figured this out in terms of producing consistent growth, inequality actually falling, pulling people out of poverty, shielding itself to some extent from the end of the commodity boom, some of the things you pointed to, it was Chile, and yet here we are. So, you know, I guess the question is, where did it go wrong? Where is policymaking failing on the economic side to the point where you've got 1.2 million people on the streets of Santiago from various segments of society?
So I think this touches on a really interesting aspect and point about inequality that often we fail to realize properly. So inequality in Chile is high, but it is still, you know, much lower than it is in other parts of Latin America, right? It is, but that doesn't matter, because what matters at the end of the day is when people in a given country and in a particular reality, so facing a particular level of inequality, what really matters when it comes to the sense of frustration that inequality creates is not the level of inequality per se. So it doesn't matter that Chile has less inequality than Brazil or other places in the region. What matters is how people feel relative to either their peers or to those who they aspire to be. So put differently, if you are poor, or if you're in the ranks of the vulnerable middle class, or if you fell back to being poor and you still see yourself as being middle class, as Michael was pointing out, it matters a lot to you how other people within that you perceive to be part of your group, or that you perceive to being, to earning a bit more than you do, how they're faring in relation to you. So the question of inequality is a relative question. It's not an absolute question. And I think this is something that oftentimes, we fail to recognize properly. So when you think about the case of Chile, we make these general remarks about, well, Chile is a country that had made such progress. They were the shining star of Latin America. They were able to, kind of fall away from this trend of truncated reforms that has always marked the region. You start a reform process and then you stop because there's some social or political upheaval that gets in the way. Chile kind of went around all of that, put all of the reforms they had to put in place, actually did get a lot of social transformation out of it, and yet people still feel dissatisfied. Why? Because in relative terms, they still perceive that it hasn't been enough. So somebody who belongs to a particular rank in Chilean society, let's say, and who's looking up might say, oh, this person who earns, 3 or 4 times my salary is faring a lot better than I am. I should be faring just as well. After all, why aren't I? So the government is failing me somehow. The policy making process is failing me somehow. So that perception of where you are relative to everybody else, that is what drives a lot of this frustration too. And this is where I think, when you look at the Chilean case, it seems to resemble the yellow vest, but I will stand with Michael, the other Michael, in that, it just resembles, the yellow vest, but it has nothing to do with the yellow vest. And it's not by chance that you do see these seemingly small economic measures actually driving people to the streets. Because what you see and what you saw in, say, 2013 in Brazil as well, which, the mass demonstrations there were about an increase in bus fares, which really wasn't that high either. It was a small increase in bus fares. But if you look at all of these measures, the bus fares in Brazil in 2013, the increase in subway fares in Chile now, the removal of fuel subsidies in Ecuador, what all of these measures have in common is that they hit people in their pocketbooks immediately. So people feel that pinch immediately. And that sparks the sense of, where am I in terms of, relative to everybody else within society? Why am I being hit? Why am I being hit if, say, the richest people in this country who have closest access to the policymakers, they're not being hit? So it creates that sense that's kind of self-feeding of frustration, and that has to do with, the sort of behavioral understanding of inequality, as it were. So it's not just about looking at the absolute levels of inequality, it's looking at the behavioral economics of inequality in a sense, which I think is something that many times we fail to pay attention to, and we fail to design the policies towards. Just one last comment on that with respect to Chile. Chile does have the additional, let's say, problem, which I think is now one of the things that they're trying to deal with, of not having done all of these reforms, having achieved all of this progress, but without actually having a proper system of, a social safety net. And I'll give an example here in terms of a measure that is currently in place. Chile is a VAT-based tax system. We know that VAT, the VAT as a tax is a very regressive tax because it's a consumption-based tax. It is going to affect the poor more than it affects the rich, unless you do something, which is something that most VAT-based tax systems do. And that is, you create mechanisms by which you compensate, sort of progressively, you compensate people for paying that tax. So if you look at other VAT-based tax systems, whether they be in Europe or elsewhere in the world, all of these systems have these mechanisms of compensation. The Chilean VAT system does not. So it's a highly regressive tax system, and it's something that actually the government can fix relatively quickly. But it speaks exactly to this failure of policymakers in understanding, where society's concerns lie and where, the problems might pop up. So it reverts back to the comments that you made. But it is a relatively easy problem to solve. So if Chile manages to actually solve some of these things that directly address these frustrations and these relative frustrations that the population's having, perhaps, they might be sending a good signal to the rest of the region as to how to fix certain problems for those countries that actually have the ability to do so.
Thanks, Monica. I want to pick up right there with Michael Shifter, which is, and ask the question, how likely is that to happen, especially in an environment, as Michael Penfold pointed out, where you have polling data pointing to deep citizen distrust towards political parties, towards the governments in power, the sense of kind of state capture. So one thing is getting the policy right, which, might be clear enough, but how do you do that when the relationship between citizens and states has been frayed in some level?
Well, I think that's the fundamental obstacle, and that's why I think it's more useful to, the policy measures and the compensation for the VAT are all good things. I'm not sure that goes to the heart of the problem. Of course, the heart of the problem is that you have this huge disconnect between the political establishment and the society, basically. And that's the problem you see in country after country. So it's not only policy making, it's politics. It's the way you do politics. It's not coming up with the right, formula, the right recipe to deal. That's important, but that's not enough. That's why when President Piñera came out and, when he apologized for his initial reaction, he said, well, we're going to raise the minimum wage and we're going to increase the pensions. It did absolutely nothing. It doesn't mean anything. And then he changed his cabinet that looked very much like his cabinet before, except it was a few years younger. That didn't change anything. You really have to understand and develop that connection with the society. And there also is a very acute, and this, especially in Chile, a generational problem. And, both the government and the opposition were very much shaped by the Pinochet era and the reaction to the Pinochet era. And the people, most of the people on the streets, it's not part of their experience for that. So there is these huge obstacles. I think that the experience, Monica knows more about the Brazilian case than I do, but I don't think the protests in 2013 really resulted in any kind of adequate response of the political class at all. And so that's a message to Chile, because, I think there is a comparison between Chile and Brazil, but, I think it's very, very hard. So, I'm not terribly optimistic, but I think the direction that has to be pursued is the nature of politics. This is a crisis of representation, as Michael said, and we're seeing it in not only Latin America, other parts of the world. And I think the societies are going in one direction, and the political class and political establishments are in another place. And that gap has to close, and I think that's the real challenge. I want to just add one thing to what Monica said about, you asked about inequality. You run the rule of law program here. Inequality is not only socioeconomic inequality. There's problems of access to justice, which are tremendously services. So there is rule of law inequality, which is profound in many, and I think that is also one of the factors that's responsible for some of this frustration and some of this anger that we're seeing.
I run the rule of law program under the iron fist of Michael Shifter. Michael Penfold, picking up on this politics question, I think your invocation of the Caracazo is powerful. You also point out that, protests are not new, that the education protests in Chile in 2011, the anti-corruption protests in Brazil in 2013 are more kind of recent precedents. But are we looking at Caracazo equivalents? What's the most sort of relevant parallel, do you think, in terms of kind of where the region is today and what the political consequences might be going forward?
Like Michael Shifter just said, that politics is at the core of this wave of mass mobilization and street protests. But I also want to be wary of jumping too quickly to, ideas of now we need to change the constitution. We need to, reform the electoral system. Because when you look at some of these polls again, and you look at public services, level of satisfaction with public services in most countries, it's terrible. It's 18%, only 18% of the population is satisfied with those services. So there is a crisis. Now, going back to politics, what I think is at the core of the crisis, perhaps, is that we have democracies. And people, their values are democratic. In most countries. Only in Peru right now, 70% of the people would accept an executive coup of some sort. Okay, only in Peru. The rest of the region is mostly, in terms of democratic values, democratic. Now, what are you seeing in this particular wave, and even in the last wave of elections, in the electoral cycles? You're seeing, well, for the first time in this election, in Argentina, for example, you had a president, as an incumbent, not even being able to make it to the second round. Most incumbent presidents in Latin America, have studied this a lot, win elections, okay? Only 2 of them had lost elections, re-election processes, re-election of the president. But this is the first time that Macri is not even able to make it even to the second round. Santos lost the first round, but he made it to the second round. And I think at the end, there is this sense among voters that the electoral process is not ending with outcomes that are relevant in terms of their quality of life and their lifestyles, and that they're fed up, for example, with the lack of alternation. There is a fact here. Ex-presidents are in many ways being too influential. Look at Dominica or the República Dominicana right now. It's incredible what's going on among the presidents and the ex-presidents. It's just, there's no sense of alternation. There's no sense that the electoral process is actually turning out with some outcomes that economic and policy making outcomes that are making people's life different. I think that means, therefore, that there is a crisis of representation. I think there is. I agree with you. But the solution to that, we have to be very careful how we deal with that. Because going back to Venezuela, look, we went through electoral reforms. We went through constitutional reforms discussions. And we went through constituent assemblies. And we went through electing outsiders. And look at the outcome, the disaster. Okay? At the end, the whole process ended up in a disaster. So Venezuela is a warning, right? Now, and this, I think, if you bring it back to Chile, which I think hay un cansancio. There is a sense that, the system is not responding. Well, of course, I mean, look at the ex-presidents. They come and go. It's like a revolving door. There's no sense of alternation within parties. There's no sense of renovation of politics. So therefore, you start blaming the electoral system. You start blaming the constitutional system, and you're going to end up blaming democracy, right? You're going to blame the legislator, whatever, for blocking these changes. So again, I think there has to be, we have to be very careful how we deal with this very important issue.
Great. There's one more issue I want to put on the table before we look at some specific cases, which is this issue of potential foreign interference, which has been raised by the Secretary General of the OAS, among others. The idea that the Cubans and the Venezuelans in particular are agitating and taking steps to actually destabilize democracies in the region. So for whoever wants to take this question, or for all of you, the question is, what concrete evidence is there that this is happening, and maybe more broadly, how worried should we be about this?
It's an hypothesis. I mean, there's no proof of this, right? But it is true that the outcome of this wave of protests for Venezuela, who is fighting to restore a democratic and constitutional order, is going to be is a real change in terms of the international scenario for Venezuela. Look at the Grupo de Lima. I mean, most of after what's happening in Ecuador and what happened in Peru, what's happening in Chile, the Peronistas coming back in Argentina, Mexico now with AMLO, it's a big change. So I understand many of those who want change in Venezuela to be very sort of worried about, wow, what happened? All of a sudden now, this opportunity is not there. Now, what I think must be highlighted, though, is the size of the Venezuelan regional problem. Because, social pressures in Colombia by the end of next year are going to be huge. And I'll bet to you that there are going to be more protests in Cúcuta and Barranquilla than in Caracas, okay? Because of the size of the migration problem, which already in relative terms in Ecuador is huge in importance, and also in Peru. And this is a region that, by the end of next year, the Venezuelan migratory immigration crisis is going to be larger than Syria. So this is going to be huge. We don't have the resources, but more importantly, there's no Germany like in Syria. There's no European infrastructure to absorb this. There's no dynamic job market in Latin America to absorb this. So I would reverse, if I had to, talk about how Venezuela might impact this wave of street protests and mass mobilizations throughout the region, I would say, well, of course it's going to be a source of social discontent in many ways, and it's going to be extremely important.
Okay. Let's look at a few of these places more specifically. Monica, Argentina has come up a couple of times. It's just had an election, which was in many ways a model. It was also a vehicle to sort of channel whatever probably significant discontent on the economic side existed in Argentina. So you haven't seen the kind of protest there recently that you've seen elsewhere. But what comes next obviously is very uncertain, especially on the economic side in terms of the relationship with the IMF, the rumors of a possible default, as well as its relations with especially the big neighbor to the north, Brazil. What do you see in Argentina for itself, but also in terms of its impact in the region, in terms of the region's geopolitics?
So let me answer that question with, I guess, a bit of a provocation. I actually think that politically, Argentina is currently more stable than its neighbor to the north, Brazil, even coming out of these elections. These elections in Argentina, we have known for a while what the outcome was likely to be. It came to pass. Yes, Macri did not get, his second term, but he finished his mandate, which is saying something, for a non-Peronist. And we actually have now a situation in Argentina where you've got, sort of a balance of power between these two coalitions, right? You've got, Cambiemos. Yeah, it's a coalition that, it's not, there are issues, but, it's broadly speaking, a coalition that is the anti-Peronist camp. And then you've got the Peronist camp, which seems to be unified in spite of Cristina. Actually, let me say something about that, which was actually a comment that somebody made on an Argentinian panel that we had at SAIS. Paula Alonso from George Washington University. She said something which was very interesting, which stuck with me because I kind of noticed the same thing, but I didn't have, she put it very eloquently, which was on the day of the election, after the results were announced and the speeches were being made, and Cristina actually was making her own speech. First, she didn't sound a lot like Cristina because she was very subdued. compared to what she usually is. But the second thing that I thought was especially interesting is that there were all these Peronists standing on the stage, many of which are her political enemies, and she turned around and she said to them, "We need to keep the Peronists unified," which to me and to Paula, and I agree with her, shows a level of vulnerability on the part of the Kirchnerist camp of the Peronists, which we haven't seen before. So taking all these factors into account, taking into account the fact that the transition of power that's taking place right now is actually going very smoothly. We saw all these very nice cordial gestures between Fernandez and Macri's in the days that followed the election. I think all of these things point to, a system that is a lot more stable, let's say, than the neighbor to the north. And I'll speak about the neighbor to the north in a second. Moving on to the economy. Yes, Argentina has massive challenges when it comes to the economy. It's facing, a financial cliff in 2020. It desperately needs the IMF. Without the IMF, it can't cover it won't be able to cover the financing gap that it has. But on both sides of this equation, so both on the IMF side as well as on the Fernandez side, the president side, there is an understanding of how severe those problems are, right? I mean, the fund knows that in a way it needs to remain engaged in Argentina to the extent that that's possible, because it has already lent $44 billion into Argentina. And unless it remains engaged, it's not going to get paid back. So there's an interest on the part of the IMF in remaining involved and in trying to find some kind of common ground with Fernandez. And on the part of Fernandez, remember, Argentina is a place where there is still a very recent trauma. The 2001 default is still a very recent trauma in the minds of the population. And so this is powerful for Fernandez when he comes to the table and has to actually negotiate with the IMF and in effect, try to sell to the population a number of things that he said he was not going to do. It turns out that if he can play the card of the trauma that a default involves in the minds of the Argentinian people, perhaps, you might find a situation where there's some common ground that will be found between the IMF and the new political leadership in Argentina. That might sound overly optimistic, in particular when it comes to Argentina, where things are always very shaky. But right now, that is as good a scenario as any other. And that in itself, makes me feel a little bit more comfortable than I would have felt otherwise. So in the case of Argentina, that's how I see things shaping up right now. Now, everything can change in like 2 months. Everything might be completely different. But right now, that's how it looks. That question of political stability, which I mentioned, or relative, again, everything's relative. Relative political stability, I think is crucial when you look at the neighbor to the north. So coming back to your other question, the thing that frightens me most about what's going on in those two countries is the level of animosity that currently exists between the Brazilian, the Bolsonaro and Fernandez. In a way, both of these leaders have been engaging in sort of, bad rhetoric towards each other, which they probably should not be doing. And in some cases, it sounds very childish. Fernandez putting up the Lula Livre sign on the day of the elections, and then Bolsonaro saying that he's not going to phone Fernandez the next day. This sounds very childish, but if we know that these things do have diplomatic repercussions. And because of the radicalization that has happened in Brazil, what I do fear is that at some point, this diplomatic tension that now exists between Brazil and Argentina may have severe consequences for Mercosur and for the things that have been happening with Mercosur. We did have the announcement of the EU-Mercosur deal. Yes, there are many obstacles in the way, so, this is by no means a guaranteed thing, but we did have that. There are negotiations going on between Japan and the Mercosur. So there are various avenues for sort of opening up these countries with these regional trade agreements and important trade agreements with other countries, and these initiatives have been taking place, but that could easily be derailed by, you know, this sort of diplomatic spat between the two largest players in Mercosur, Brazil and Argentina. Let me then say a word about Brazil. Why do I think that Brazil is unstable? I think Brazil is unstable, first of all, because it does have a political leader at the moment that doesn't really have a political party. Yes, nominally the party exists, okay? PSL nominally exists. But if you're watching Brazil, and you don't have to watch it on a daily basis because it's kind of like a soap opera, you can miss a few episodes and still know what's going on. But if you're watching it at all, you know that PSL is not a unified party. It has a lot of, you know, loose wires, and I think that's the perfect way to put it. It has a lot of loose wires in it. And so there isn't a solid sort of party base for the president. So far, that hasn't been a problem when it comes to pension reform. So we actually did get pension reform done, which everybody looks at and says, wow, how can you do that in an environment like this? But I think what explains that is the fact that we've been talking pension reform to death over the past 20 plus years, and especially during the past 4 years. So at some point that was going to get done in spite of the government, which I think is exactly what's happened. And you did have, you know, the Congress standing firmly behind this reform. But then you look at all other aspects of this government and you see attacks on democratic institutions almost on a daily basis. You see referrals to the military dictatorship. You see the president's son talking about, you know, measures that were taken during the military dictatorship, during the worst of the military dictatorship, in fact. You know, the famous AI-5, the institutional act that closed Congress and imposed censorship and, you know, the persecution of political opponents and all of that. These things are being said out in the open in Brazil and constantly, like on a day, as I said, on a daily basis. That does not speak of political stability to me. And so, you know, when again, going back to my provocation in the beginning, when I look at a country as big as Brazil is, you know, 40% of the region, economically very important, and I see this sort of thing going on, that scares me. And it scares me not just for Brazil, it scares me for the region as a whole. So that's what I have to say about these two.
Two for the price of one there.
Oh, and by the way, we will have that face-off between Brazil and Argentina in the Libertadores Cup, which, by the way, is going to take place in Chile, I think, still, right? Yeah.
They moved to Lima.
Oh, in Lima.
You
Okay.
should move to Lima before you buy your tickets to Santiago. Yeah. Or Madrid, if that's where they end up, like last year. Michael, you lived in Peru for many years. Know it well. The history of dissolving Congress in Peru is not a particularly happy one. And yet, Vizcarra's move had a lot of public support, given the low esteem in which Peruvians hold members of the Congress. Do you see this as a basis for political renewal, or as a dangerous precedent for Peruvian democracy?
Look, when Fujimori closed the Congress in Peru in 1992, he got 84% supported him. So Vizcarra got it off easy. When you say the Peruvian, the support for the executive dissolving Congress in Peru is high, you also have to take into account the Congress, right? I mean, there are realities. I mean, Congresses are different in different countries, and the confidence that people have. So people will be more willing to sort of support an executive to dissolve Congress if the Congress is disaster. And so I'm not surprised by that. I am worried. First of all, what the Constitutional Court, I think, is still to decide finally whether what he did is constitutional. I'm not a lawyer, you are. It seems to me a little ambiguous of what he did. It depends how you interpret, the law. But, the important point is, and this is building on what Monica said about Bolsonaro, is that it troubles me when the military comes out in Peru and, takes a side between two branches of government, the executive and the Congress, and supports Vizcarra. The Peruvians also, it's been a while, but they also have a history of military rule. So that troubles me, and I don't see what we're seeing now. There are going to be elections in January for Congress, and what's fascinating about these elections, it's called sort of the election express, because everybody who has any aspiration to be president in 2021 is now presenting themselves for Congress in January 2020 as sort of a test to see if they have any political viability to be elected president. The great paradox about and puzzle about Peru is that its politics. I lived there in the late 80s, early 90s, and we're talking about the lack of political parties and policymaking. I mean, it goes back a long time in Peru. The first term of Alan Garcia was, the worst thing that I think we've seen until Venezuela, perhaps in South America. So it has a history of very weak political parties and political institutions and not very good leaders. All the former presidents are in jail or being investigated in Peru. So, and yet, what's really interesting is that the economy is seems to be on automatic a little bit and is still going pretty well. So you have this kind of real paradox, I think, in Peru that's been there for a long time. Whether that will happen forever, I don't know, but it really is striking. But I'm worried about the military coming back, and publicly taking a stance in supporting Vizcarra and showing support. And of course, popular opinion was also, as you said, was also with Vizcarra. But it makes me it does make me a little bit uncomfortable how this is playing out.
Michael Penfold, to you, we haven't talked much about Bolivia. You mentioned the case of your country where democratic institutions and checks and balances were systematically dismantled by elected governments over the course of a couple of decades. Are we witnessing the same thing in Bolivia?
Well, I think there are a lot of similarities, but there's a basic difference, right? Which is Bolivia has been economically responsible, and it has been growing at very high rates, in part because of commodity prices, but also because they've been more fiscally responsible than in the past, right? So, and that's not the case in Venezuela, quite the opposite. Venezuela has been accumulating a huge macroeconomic imbalances and hyperinflation now for the last years. Now, the Morales sort of consequences of this fallout with the first round, I think it's because it highlights first this regional trend towards re-election, and in some countries like Nicaragua, Venezuela, and now Bolivia, more informally, because it's done through the judicial branch rather than through any constitutional reform, this sort of indefinite re-election process, right? And this is extremely problematic for governance. It is, because the incumbency advantage is huge. The ability to co-opt different branches of power and undermine the rule of law and the division of powers is also huge. So my view with Bolivia is, perhaps Morales, the OAS for me is sometimes a mystery because it takes a stance with some countries in Nicaragua and Venezuela, and then it takes a very different one in Bolivia too. So it's unclear to me exactly where they're going to stand on this particular issue. Because you might validate the electoral process, but at the end, the real issue in Bolivia has to do with
with constitutionality. It has to do with whether it was right for this president to run for re-election again or not. But it doesn't really matter. It happened. But the consequences of this in Bolivia, I think, in 2, 3, 4 years down the road are going to be huge, because I think you're already seeing that the governance crisis in Bolivia is going to deepen. And I think also that's going to have an economic effect. And it's also I can basically foresee a country that is going to become even more polarized than it was before.
I have one last quick question for each of you, and then I want to open it up. So the question is, what else should we be watching? What's if another country is to explode, so to speak, what do we think it will be? Monica, I assume we already have your answer, but perhaps you can tell us what the spark might be, or where the energy might be coming from in a country that Bolsonaro really sort of dominates politically, and there is not a clear kind of alternative source of kind of political energy at present. So where we might see that come from.
That second part is true. Whether he dominates it or not is a different question. But so obviously Brazil is on the list. And, was this not, we are now about 9-10 months into the Bolsonaro administration, so it hasn't quite been a year. Soon it will be, and then it'll be a year and a half. The fact is that apart from this political dysfunction, which still characterizes the country, albeit perhaps less than, a few years ago, but the political dysfunction is still there. We're talking about an economy that is growing very, very slowly, that had a massive recession in 2015 and 2016, that has seen, as I said in the beginning of my remarks, an extreme reversion in the social trends that have been ongoing. The rise in poverty that I mentioned, the 50% increase in poverty, that's extreme poverty that we're talking about. That's people that live on less than $50 a month. Okay. These are 13.5 million people that we're talking about. So this is the level of social strife that we see in Brazil when we look at those numbers. When we move up into unemployment, Brazil currently has an unemployment rate of 11.8. That's come down from 13% last year. But that reduction in unemployment, when you actually look at, what the composition of the labor market is currently like and where that reduction has come from, that reduction has come from an increase in informality. That reduction has come from more jobs in the gig economy. In other words, more Uber drivers. So people who have precarious jobs. And by and large, people who have other types of precarious jobs, as in they do not have, the proper sort of social benefits or, labor benefits that would have applied. They're relatively low paying jobs. They're low skilled jobs. So, this improvement in the unemployment numbers has nothing to do or has actually reflected even more, I should say, the level of economic insecurity that people feel. So that is very real and very present in Brazil right now. What would it take for Brazil to topple into, let's say, something like what happened in 2013? I don't think much. I think, at the moment, there is still a sense that a lot of benefit of the doubt has been given to this government. They just passed the pension reform. They promised that after they pass the pension reform, growth would pick up. That's unlikely to happen. Probably growth will continue to be lackluster as it has been, and the recovery will continue to be slow. Or even if it does pick up a little bit, it's not going to be enough to reverse these labor market trends that I was speaking of. So, a few months out, maybe sometime in 2020, there will be some kind of something that some kind of trigger that sparks, a very real sense of economic insecurity that is pervasive in the country, and which a large part of the country is currently, well, a large part, I should say, amongst the elites are currently ignoring. So you don't see, and this is striking to me, you don't see in Brazil right now people either from the financial sector or from, companies or from academia, which is the most striking part of it, actually saying anything about, the risks that currently exist. And in a sense, I feel almost as if, and I'm going to say something provocative again, I feel almost as if we are in a state where, the country's in a state of a sort of a Stockholm syndrome, where, you've been invaded by, people that are hurting institutions and hurting human rights, but this is the only option on the table, so you feel as if you have to support them. I think Brazil is kind of caught in that kind of dynamic, but eventually it's going to break out of that. And once it does, it could be extremely turbulent because the situation really is that grave.
Thanks, Monica. Michael S., what should we be watching?
I was optimistic.
I have to keep up my reputation here when it comes to Brazil, you know that.
Are there any countries left? No, I mean, I've been very humbled by Chile. So I think all of us are now much more cautious or many of us are more cautious than we used to be, because, when people call up and, what's the country that's least likely to have instability, the answer was always Chile. And look what happened. So I don't know. I mean, the only case that I think is worth looking at is Colombia, where a lot of what's been said by both Michael and Monica can apply to Colombia as well. I mean, look at the last elections, the regional elections. These are a total repudiation of the traditional political class in Colombia, which has been building for a while, but I think it's getting strong. And whether the politics can change in a way that these new parties, smaller parties and movements can kind of come together and capture that, I think it's an opportunity, but there's no guarantee. It also has, it is a good economic performer still relatively in the region, but it just strikes me as listening to my distinguished panelists here that there are some parallels.
Migration issue
Migration issue, right.
Michael.
Just very, very briefly, I think, the last wave prior to this one of street protests ended up with two very significant elections. I mean, the election of AMLO in Mexico and the election of Bolsonaro in Brazil, which were completely unexpected, out of the box, which showed a big shift in voters' preferences, right? And my view is that the size of this wave of street protests is so significant that I wouldn't be surprised that now we're starting, a new electoral cycle in January 2020, going on through 2021, basically. That we're going to see some extraordinary political outcomes coming out of those elections. I'm really worried about the Andes. It's not, beyond Peru. Economically, it's just, doing well, but not extraordinarily well. And I think the migration crisis and the pressure from Venezuela is going to be huge. We're already 4.5 million migrants right now. And a large portion of those are refugees, and most of them are going to Colombia because there's visa restrictions, and now in Ecuador and in Peru and in other places. So I think Colombia is gonna go through some major social changes. How well they're gonna cope with that? Well, it's gonna depend. So far, it's fascinating. The real heroes right now dealing with the social issues that are emerging are mayors, local mayors in Barranquilla, in Cúcuta,
who are the ones who are really coping with the thing. Well, but it's beyond their capacities now. So I think at some point this is also going to be a major national issue, and it's going to be a redefining in many ways the electoral process in Colombia, in Ecuador, even in Peru.
Thank you all so much. We have some time left, so let's take maybe 3 questions to start, and we'll start right there.
Thanks. Isaac Maida from Free Balance. Is Cuba a common denominator? If so, how would you neutralize it? Thanks.
Okay, next question. Let's go, the back here.
Alex Sanchez, James Defense. Question. One country that has not been mentioned was actually Nicaragua. 1 year ago, we had the massive protests in Nicaragua. We had a lot of meetings here in the dialogue, in CSIs, all over the city, saying, is this the end of the Ortega regime? He even flirted with the idea that he may call for earlier elections. He has, I think it was back in April, he said he's not going to do that. The elections will take place now in 2021. What do you think of Nicaragua, about how the Ortega regime has really managed to survive everything that has happened there for the past year and a bit? Thank you.
Anyone else? Let's go right here.
Yes, thank you. I know this is not a panel of economists, except for Monica, but maybe I'd like some comments about, I think one of the factors that could determine this is precisely economics. Now, they speak about buen capitalismo, mal capitalismo, o capitalismo salvaje. Okay, the good capitalism, which is regulated, we can think of Scandinavia maybe, also it's part of Europe. But in the case of, in this case, neoliberalism, Milton Friedman, the Chicago Boys, which was like the model in Chile, okay, it fell down, no more. And yet, we're not thinking about socialism as well. I mean, we know what happened with the real socialism in the Soviet Union. But maybe a comment from you, considering this. In the case of Peru, if you allow me just 30 seconds, millions of Peruvians have a lot of reasons to do what they did in Chile. And in Chile, they were ready to burn the city down. In Peru, they were really ready to burn Congress down. And one thing that stopped them so far is the struggle or the fight against corruption, precisely. And that I would like an opinion, because this is decisive. I mean, when you see President one killed himself because he was really already, he knew he was going to jail. The other one is 25 years in prison for corruption and homicides and human rights violations. The other one is here in the United States waiting for extradition. The other one, 80 years old, is in house arrest. The other one, former military, will be probably in jail as well with his wife. But the reason, what they say, that something like Chile didn't happen in Peru so far, is because people feel, they sense that some justice is being done. I mean, it doesn't, the spark, a lot of water is the struggle against corruption. And that's the reason that maybe that has to do with the flaws of the economic system, that maybe, in this case, in the United States, with Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, their proposals, and Joe Biden wants to stay in the middle. But this is sort of, I think it's an issue that could deserve more consideration. When you find corruption, or you fight corruption, we have 5 presidents already being prosecuted, and one of them killed himself, then that could be a reason that determines upheaval or revolution or democracy.
Great, thank you. I think this goes to the
Thank
state
you.
capture issue, Michael, that you raised at the beginning. Maybe let's go reverse order and start with you and continue with Michael and Monica.
I'll focus in the last question. I think it's this perception of it's not a perception, it's a reality, right? That corruption is a real big issue, and it's at the core of people's perception
on fairness, on trust, on public institutions, and also on their ability to translate votes into policy, right? And they perceive that corruption is not allowing that to happen because, in some cases, because of Congress. This is not the first time, they're ready to burn down the Congress. I mean, in Peru, there's a history, right? It's not the first time that there's street protests, and that the indigenous communities in Ecuador come out and protest, right? And this is essential. Now, in the case of Peru, I agree. I think there is this view that, that the judicial system has been punishing particularly a type of corruption that, as Michael mentioned, is regional. It's a multi-Latina, right? I mean, it's part of the ecosystem at the regional level, how companies operate in the region, particularly related to infrastructure projects. So I think this is a huge issue. My biggest worry, though, is when do people start feeling that there's a change? Because, PPK is not there, Fujimori is not there, Garcia now is, committed suicide. Vizcarra looks well so far, maybe, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 years down the road after he leaves the presidency, something happens to him too, in terms of any judicial process. When does it stop? When does it, all these cases transform themselves in a different perception on behalf of public opinion of what's going on with the political parties? I say this because my sense it's, once you enter into this process, it's very difficult to reverse this perception that the whole elite is completely corrupt, that is a basket case, that you end up, like in Mexico recently, shifting the whole elite. But as you shift the whole power structure through elections, you're also shifting, the power of different groups, and even the control of the president, of the Congress, and therefore of his ability to pursue constitutional reforms, and the uncertainty of what kind of reforms he's gonna continue doing, because he has that power. Well, what I'm trying to say is that this is the risk, and the risk is not a low risk. I think it's a very high risk that there's obviously corruption is driving a lot of people's very upsetting perceptions about how politics and public institutions work, but there's also a huge risk involved in that. With regards to Nicaragua, this is the thing. Street mobilization and street protests ends, because politics matters. They end up in with different outcomes. In the case of Nicaragua, we were hoping that those street protests would end up opening up the political system in Nicaragua. It didn't happen. That was the same case in Venezuela in 2017. It's the same case in Venezuela still in 2017. We don't know exactly what's going to happen now in Bolivia with all the street mobilizations, particularly in the provinces. But there are going to be different outcomes. That's what I'm trying to say of how, different political systems respond to the stimulus created by people's, right, because it's their right to come out and protest. Obviously, in some cases, it's civilized. In others, it's uncivilized, and it turns out very violently.
First of all, for the record, we have at the dialogue, we have a Nicaragua task force, and we're focusing sustained attention with meetings here, meetings in the region on Nicaragua with Nicaraguans and others. So I want to just say that for the record. Secondly, I think, what Ortega has done is something that I think is, what I think all of these people are basically betting on is that people will get tired and these people can weather the storm. And so after April 18th of last year, everything exploded in Nicaragua. A lot of protests, a lot of killings, a lot of people leaving the country in order. But, I think that what they think is that things will settle down. People may not be happy, things may not be going well, but their power won't be threatened. And I think that's what Hernandez thinks in, Honduras. He had an election that was widely questioned as illegitimate. There have been lots of protests in Honduras, but, he's trying to hang in there and weather the storm. And I think that's what Evo's going to do. And I think that's what he hopes. Eventually, the people that are out in the streets that are protesting, the fraud and claiming there's fraud, well, their capacity to sustain that level is a big question. I'm not predicting how it will work out, and I think it might be more complicated in Bolivia than the other cases. But I think the parallels there is this is the way they're reacting. I mean, Maduro, in some ways, has done that too, right? The people will just kind of, just kind of get tired and stop protesting, and and then go home. So I think Nicaragua is a case of that. Now everybody's focusing on the election in 2021. I think there's been completely lost any hope or possibility of any kind of negotiation before then.
So let me just say a final word on neoliberalism. First, let me say that I hate that term. I really do. And I think it mischaracterizes so many things, and it's thrown around, and people mean different things by neoliberalism when they use it. So I have issues with, I have issues with neoliberalism. So I think the discussion is a lot more about the size of government. That's the issue. So when I look at, when I look at the region, but specifically when I look at Brazil, where that discussion is very lively today, one of the main thing that's going on between what we're calling the left and we're calling the right, apart from social issues and family values and all this other stuff that came into the political discourse in Brazil recently, especially with the rise of a far right that is trying to emulate whatever the same kind of movement that exists here in the U.S. But leaving that aside, the discussion is really about, what went wrong under the PT government, specifically under the Dilma administration, which was very much about big state and big government. And now you have sort of the opposite leaning on and that is personified by the current economy minister, who is himself a Chicago boy. Literally, he did study in Chicago at that time. So his mindset is that of a small, minimal or minimalist state. So the discussion that's going on in Brazil right now is that's what we need, because the big state or the large state or the maximal state, whatever you want to call it, the big government model that we had in the past, that's what led us to have a lot of corruption, and that's what led us to have the recession. That's what led us to have a lot of economic mismanagement. I don't disagree with any of those views. What I do disagree with is that the minimal state is what solves it. Because if we are going to go to the other end of this, and if we are going to say, we need to have, we need to minimize the role of government to the point where government is only really offering the very basic of the very basic services, that's a trap. And that's a trap because the countries that we're talking about here, in Brazil specifically, has a lot of poverty, has a lot of inequality. You can't do away with the welfare state, no matter how minimalist your mindset might be. So that's a fallacious debate. Going from big government to small government, that's a fallacious debate. What you need to be debating is what is the adequate size of the government, taking into account efficiency concerns and all sorts of other concerns and fiscal concerns and everything else. What is the right size for the government, given that you have this very large inequality problem that reaches all sorts of different dimensions. So it's not just about incomes, it's about access to services, it's about gender inequality, it's about racial inequality, it's about access to education. It just reaches all sorts of different levels. What is the adequate size of the government that you need to have? That's where the discussion should be. Unfortunately, because of the level of polarization that we're seeing in all of our societies, it ends up being a completely misguided economic debate that is going to lead to bad policies and is once again going to lead to the sense that you were referring to earlier, Michael, that ultimately the policies are not serving society and are not serving the population. So that's the risk that I see, ongoing as this goes forward.
Thank you all. This has been a wonderful discussion. Thank you all for joining us late in the day, and please join me in a round of applause for our panelists.